All right, I have a little bit after 6 on my end here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Holly Grand. I'm going to be facilitating our webinar here this evening, and I just want to run through a few quick reminders before we get started here. Your cameras, your microphones, and chat are all going to be disabled throughout the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions at any point during the presentation today, please use that Q&A feature that's located on the bottom of the screen in Zoom. The button looks like 2 little chat bubbles, so you can click that and type your question in there. We're going to answer questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to type your question at any point during the presentation, just so you don't forget or anything like that. If you want to provide comments about the proposed Mariculture site, you have to email them to our designated email address. That'll be shown at several points during the webinar here this evening, and you'll get a follow-up email tomorrow from Zoom with that same information there. We are not taking comments through Zoom, so please, again, if you have any of those comments, please email them to our email address. We are recording this webinar here this evening as well, so if you missed a portion of it or want to share it, you will be getting a link again in your email tomorrow about where to find the recording. And I think that's all really I have to go over, so I'm going to hand it over to Zach Olson, who's going to be doing our presentation here this evening. Zach?
Thanks, y'all. Holly, can you hear me, see me, and everything?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, well, thank you all for tuning in tonight. This is a public hearing for a proposed cultivated oyster mariculture grow out facility, specifically site G-0005, the G really just standing for grow out facility, and 5 being the, this is the 5th completed permit that we've received for cultivated oyster mariculture. For those of you that have set in on some of these public hearings before, this is going to look pretty similar to how some of the public hearings have looked in the past. But for those of you who haven't set in on any of these, I just want to run through a couple of things we're going to talk about tonight. Number one, we're going to go over just some very brief basic information about just cultivated oyster mariculture in Texas. We realize this is still a very new program, and a lot of folks don't really understand exactly what it is or the sorts of operations we see with oyster mariculture. So we're going to spend a little bit of time just talking about cultivated oyster mariculture in general. Then we're going to pivot to the specific grow-out facility that we're here to talk about tonight, the grow-out facility proposed for the Copano Bay area. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can give public comment if you choose to do so. As Holly said, we're not going to be taking public comment via Zoom tonight. You have to submit public comment via email. We'll provide that email to you at the end of the presentation, but there will be just a quick couple of minutes for anybody to ask any questions they might have via that question answer window. Get any questions answered that might help you more accurately or efficiently provide public comment. So we'll start with just a quick overview of what cultivated oyster mariculture is in Texas. So TPWD started accepting applications for cultivated oyster mariculture in September of 2020. Now this is off-bottom mariculture. And so what do we mean by off-bottom? In general, off-bottom mariculture uses cages or floating bags that are placed in a permitted site within a bay system, and those cages or floating bags then float in the water column. Oyster seed from hatcheries, oyster hatcheries, is stocked into these floating cages or bags. So to reiterate, these oysters are not coming from wild reefs. These are explicitly coming from oyster hatcheries. And then those cages and oysters are worked and cleaned in various ways to produce a valuable product. In Texas, applicants nominate their own sites, and then after consult with the department, they're required to conduct a natural resource survey on that site to make sure there are no natural resource impacts for the proposed site. So just to give you an idea of what some of the different types of oyster mariculture look like. In the world of oyster mariculture, we see floating cages. You can see kind of on the upper left-hand side of your screen there, floating bags, and there's also what's called an adjustable longline system. The site we're going to be looking at tonight is going to be proposing the use of these floating cages, and that's been pretty standard for a lot of oyster farms that we've seen in Texas so far. So a little bit more background information about the program. Once a permit is given to an applicant, the permit is good for 10 years. There is an annual fee associated with those permits based on the size of the grow out or nursery facility. But there are other agencies that hold authority over different aspects of oyster mariculture. And applicants, after they receive their initial conditional permit, which would happen after the applicant gets through the public hearing phase, they can then take that conditional permit and go to these other agencies to get the various authorizations they need from them to conduct oyster mariculture in Texas. Those other agencies include the General Land Office, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Coast Guard. We do have an active use criteria for our oyster mariculture permit holders, and essentially what that boils down to is a minimum number of oyster seed that need to be stocked on a permitted farm per year. We do only allow Eastern oyster in oyster mariculture in Texas. That is the native oyster, and specifically Eastern oyster from Texas broodstock. Because harvest is not coming from wild reefs, we do allow year-round harvest for mariculture facilities, but those facilities must still comply with all Texas Department of State Health Services regulations. So we'll kind of move now to the specific site, the specific proposed site for oyster mariculture. This proposed site is an oyster grow out facility. And so what that means is that this facility could grow oysters out to market sized oysters. So they'll grow oysters out to the size at which they could be sold into the food market. It is located in Copano Bay. That's part of the Aransas Bay ecosystem. I'll show a map here in a second, just so you can see exactly where that's at. It is within Shellfish Harvest Area TX32, which is approved waters by the Department of State Health Services for shellfish harvest. And the total acreage of the site is 5 acres. So the map you see to the left on your screen is a map of kind of the Corpus Bay all the way to the bottom, Aransas Bay, and then Copano Bay kind of at the top. And this red circle that hopefully you can see my pointer is pointing to, that is the proposed site, kind of in the bay side portion of Copano Bay, kind of between Bayside and Mission Bay. Zoom in a little bit on that site. This black box is the proposed 5-acre site. Just some specifics on that. It's about 5,000 foot from the shoreline. And again, that site is 5 acres. So there are 2 proposed access routes for this site that the applicant has proposed. The primary access route would access using the public boat ramp in the Bayside area and access the site directly. An alternative or secondary route would use a public boat ramp in Port Bay, I believe that's Redfish Camp, to access the site. So this site's a lot to take in. So let me just kind of explain what you're looking at here. This is a schematic, kind of a schematic from the sky of the proposed 5-acre site. And what you see are essentially lines of mariculture cages. The different colored dots or stars are anchors and buoys. We'll talk a little bit about exactly what those anchors and buoys look like here in a second. And the black boxes are the individual oyster mariculture cages. Now you can kind of see that there are kind of from top to bottom 3 lines of cages, and from left to right 23 rows of cages. This map you're looking at here represents the maximum layout view. So this would be the maximum density of cages that the applicant has proposed on their site. That's a total of 966 cages in the 5-acre site. Applicants do also give a minimum site layout, and the minimum site layout that's proposed here is 570 cages. And typically the reason for a minimum and a maximum layout is that it allows the applicant to kind of start smaller and scale up as they become more successful in oyster mariculture. But like I said, the schematic you're looking at now is the maximum array of cages, 966. So this is kind of a zoomed in, still view from the top of 2 rows of cages, just to give you some more specifics about those cages. So there are 14 cages in each row. You can kind of see at the end of each row is an anchor. That's a helix anchor and a buoy. So each row of cages is anchored, and there's a navigation lane given between the rows of cages of 20 foot. So again, this is the maximum array of cages. For the minimum array of cages, it wouldn't be spaced into quite so densely. Those navigation lanes would be a little bit larger. So some details about the operations plan. So the applicant is proposing to use floating cages, and specifically the Oyster Grow high flow cage system. So if you've set in on any past Oyster Mariculture public hearings, you'll know that this is a fairly common setup for Oyster Mariculture. Again, and we'll talk specifically about what those cages look like here in a second. But again, maximum layout of 966 cages. Each row of cages is anchored to the bay bottom with a 6-foot helix anchor, polypropylene main lines, really visible buoys at the end of each line, which creates a very visible kind of line of buoys that are on each dimension of the 5-acre site. In addition to that, the U.S. Coast Guard typically requires navigational markers, and as you heard in the beginning, the U.S. Coast Guard will be one of the agencies that the applicant will have to consult with, and so the applicant will be following any U.S. Coast Guard requirements. The applicant has also proposed the use of bird deterrents if needed. Some other oyster farms in this area have really not seen a big issue with birds sitting on their cages. And so the applicant really just has a plan in place in case they need to start using them. But 3 bird deterrents are proposed: gulf sweepers, bird away hawk systems, and then large zip ties, which essentially creates spikes or ticklers on each cage. The gulf sweepers and bird away hawk system are essentially a flag or a kite system, and we'll show some pictures of those in a second. But the goal there is to scare birds away from their cages, keep anything from defecating on the cages. So zooming in a little bit to the Oyster Grow cage system, you can kind of see this really just looks like 2 large ballasts with a large cage on top. And then within that cage, farmers will typically use various size mesh bags to place their oyster seed, and oftentimes changing that mesh size out as they grow. These cages have 3 different positions. We have a feeding position. You can kind of see on the left of your screen there. Essentially, in the feeding position, those ballasts float the cage just in the water column, allowing the oysters to feed. The flipped position is used to pull those cages and those oysters out of the water, allowing them to dry and desiccate, which is an important part of the oyster mariculture process. And then that 3rd submerged position is really just reserved for tropical activity, or trying to get the gear down in the water column and away from if there's a hurricane or other tropical activity coming to the area, just to keep the applicant from losing gear. And these are some pictures of those bird deterrents. So the gulf sweeper is a picture kind of at the bottom right here, and then the hawk away system kind of on the right-hand side. So just some general operations we have in our operations plan. So again, we require applicants to submit with their application a complete operations plan outlining their proposed activities on the site. So the applicant proposes to access the site via shallow draft boat, a minimum of 2 times a week. The floating cage systems will be flipped for desiccation, as we kind of saw in some of those diagrams previously. Any pressure washing of the gear will be done, will be taken to shore and away from the water body to do that. Oysters will be tumbled and sorted as needed. And then, of course, the applicant will adhere to any federal and state requirements for pre-harvest resubmerging. The applicant also submits a hurricane plan. And in short, this hurricane plan boils down to pre-season preparation and drills for essentially sinking those cages if need be. And then there's essentially a code yellow, code red system depending on where a storm is predicted or where a storm exists in the Gulf. And then, of course, after a storm passes, working to refloat those cages and retrieve any lost gear. So I mentioned this earlier, but we require all applicants to conduct a natural resources survey of their proposed site. And the purpose of this is really just to make sure that any mariculture activities on the site are not going to be impactful to natural resources, specifically seagrasses and oyster reef. We require a minimum of 200-foot buffer from any seagrass and a minimum of 500-foot buffer from any oyster reef. And so the applicant conducted their natural resources survey using a side scan sonar, and then they also conducted in situ sediment grab samples to ground truth, and also to look into the sediment within that 200-foot buffer and on site for seagrasses. They used a modified post hole grabber for those grab samples. The take-home message from the natural resources survey is that there were no seagrass or oyster reef encountered within the proposed site or the buffer, and this lines up pretty well with oyster and seagrass maps that we as a department have for this area. So all samples consisted of mud, and kind of the picture you're looking at there is a representative sample of that. This is a map of the natural resources survey that was conducted. So the black square in the middle is the 5-acre proposed site. The first boundary is a 200-foot buffer, and that second boundary is a 500-foot buffer. So again, a side scan sonar survey was conducted within that entire 500-foot buffer and in, and then there were essentially sediment grab samples on each of the points that you see given here. And again, the take home there was that there were no seagrass or oyster samples, seagrass or oyster specimens detected in any of those samples or in the side scan sonar. So that wraps up the information that we have for you tonight for this particular site. So I just want to finish with some details on next steps. So if you do wish to submit public comment on this site, you may do so at the oyster.mariculture at tpwd.texas.gov website, or I'm sorry, email address. The public comment deadline for this particular application is October 4th, 2022. And then kind of the next steps there, once the applicant gets through this public hearing phase, they'll be issued a conditional permit, which is good for 1 year. That conditional permit does not clear them to do mariculture activities. All that does is it clears them to now go to those multiple other agencies, including the General Land Office, Army Corps of Engineers, who hold authority on different aspects of oyster mariculture. With that conditional permit, they'll go to those agencies and get the necessary leases or permits or necessary authorizations. Once they've gathered all of those authorizations from the various agencies, they'll bring all of that back to us at TPWD. We'll review it, make sure everything's in order, and then at that point they'll be issued their final permit and mariculture activities can begin. As always, for more information on oyster mariculture, please visit our website, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's website. We have a really good oyster mariculture page on there with a lot of information. You can see any other pending mariculture applications and learn more about how to access those public hearings and where those sites are located. And then finally, I'll just leave this this email address up on the screen again. If you're wanting to submit public comment, please do so to the email address provided here. And that said, we will open it up for any questions that anybody might have. Again, this is not public comment. If you have public comment about this site, please submit that to the email address. But if you have any questions, or if you're unclear on anything about this particular site, I encourage you to type your question into the question and answer box, and we'll try to get that answered. So we will open it up for questions now. Okay, well, I don't see any questions coming through. So Holly, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. So again, just another reminder that you will be getting a follow-up email tomorrow from Zoom. I think it actually might come from Oyster Mariculture or something like that instead of actually Zoom. So keep an eye out for that. We have the deadline in there again for public comment and the link to our YouTube channel where you will be able to watch the recording of this webinar. And I think with that, we will go ahead and head out. Thank you everyone for joining us here this evening. We appreciate it a lot.